Well, good afternoon, colleagues. It is just about afternoon. I'm sorry to have to drop in and out. I've got an urgent appointment that I need to keep in just a few minutes' time, so apologies for dashing off. It's a privilege, as always, to say a few words at this book launch. As colleagues know, I'm extremely supportive of the Centre for Cultural Disability Studies and indeed of the department that has been so well and ably led by Claire, and with the commitment of the whole team. It's come on in leaps and bounds, it really has. This particular publication is part of that activity, which is, as I say, very significant. The amount of activity that one sees on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis coming from that particular quarter is very impressive, and I'm deeply indebted to David and to others for all of the energy that's gone into that. This is a monograph, and as colleagues know, a monograph is a research-based, single-authored work which is in some way going to take things forward. It may be through the dissemination of existing knowledge put into new context, or it may be the generation of new knowledge, or a mixture of both. And I'm sure, knowing David as I do, that it's probably the latter, a mixture of both. That is, generation of new knowledge, but a concern to disseminate and make available that knowledge in a format that is easily accessible across the sector and those involved in this particular area of activity. It is an important contribution to the field. There is a lot that's said about this on the blurb on the back, which I've got in front of me here, and I probably could do no better than to read out a few of the key sentences. Cultural disability studies in education encourages educators and students to engage with disability as an isolating, hurtful and joyful experience that merits multiple levels of representation and offers true potential for a non-normative social aesthetic. It will be required reading for all scholars. Publishers love to know this, David. But not only that, it will be required reading of all scholars and students of disability studies, cultural disability studies in education, sociology and cultural studies. So I'm sure you're looking forward to your royalty check in due course. Obviously has a very wide readership. I do know Routledge quite well for various reasons. I know that it's a top-class publisher, and I know that they do produce their books extremely well, and they have a good marketing department which enables the dissemination of the information and the research that the volume contains. So it is a very good publisher to meet that desire to bring research into the social and academic arena. David is a great colleague, and I know quite a bit about the work that he's done over the several years now, many years that he's been with us. With a risk possibly of slightly embarrassing David, he is a selfless individual who has always got time for others. And his work in bringing together research from his colleagues and from the wider community engaged in cultural disability studies is a mark, I think, of a real scholar and somebody who takes an interest in other people's CVs as well as his own. And believe me, as PVC academic, I meet quite a lot of people who have a pretty focused interest in their own CVs. But David brings together that high-level scholarship, high-level research, an academic career, which has resulted very recently in his promotion to the personal chair here at the university, together with a real concern to enable other people to follow in his footsteps in terms of academic distinction. So it is a real joy to see so many people here and to share in the launch of this particular book and to celebrate everything that David does more widely, but particularly on this occasion in the book that we have before us. So congratulations, David, and thank you very much indeed for everything you bring to your department, to your colleagues, to my faculty, our faculty, and to the university more widely. And at that, I will get back to my meeting. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Kenneth. That was really kind and generous. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. That was very nice. And thanks to everybody who's come here today, and especially those of you who have come for the book launch in particular. A few people just arrived, which is flattering and much appreciated. Although I will stress at this point, you'd be wise to stay for the next part as well. But as I said before, I would say that, wouldn't I? So I'm hoping lots of you have got drinks and so on, and your glasses are charged, as they say, which I haven't really used that sort of phrase before. And then I'll just chat about this book for a little while, and then we can get on with lunch and so on. Okay then, so I'll try to start at the beginning, and I'll just try to stay as focused as I can. Okay then, so Cultural Disability Studies in Education. This is the book I'm going to try to focus on here, and keeping focus is my one real target for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. So I'll just say a few things about this book before I open it up, as it were. It's part of the Advances in Disability Studies series, which as Kenneth has said, is one of the Routledge projects. And this is the third book that we've got as in the CCDS in that series, so it's nice to be part of that. And I actually did opt in to that, as it were. It wasn't necessarily going to be the case with this book, but I'm so keen on that series and what it does that I kind of I thought that might be nice to stay with it. So there are a few things I wanted to say about the book in terms of format and so on. So, okay, it's pretty standard. It is a monograph, just about. I think it's a monograph, just about. It's 8 chapters, introduction, kind of conclusion. So nothing radical there. Some of the things that are a bit more unusual, it does have a glossary of terms at the end, which is largely the kind of terms that I've brought to the field. Or at least my slant on those terms. So it's the kind of way that I use terms within the book and perhaps within the things I've written more broadly. So that's one aspect of it that perhaps is worth noting. Another aspect is that at the end of each chapter you've got a list of indicative questions to make it a little bit more friendly, as it were, to educators and students, because part of what the book does is meant to be based on conversation, or on education as a conversation. So I try to kind of ease that process or encourage that process throughout the book. Another thing that perhaps is worth mentioning is that I do have a kind of highly recommended book at the end of each chapter as well. So again, it just opens it up. It's not necessarily a book that I use in that chapter, but it is one that I would recommend for anyone who wants to kind of go down the route that's set out within whichever chapter we might be talking about. I suppose the only other thing that might be worth mentioning structurally is, it's available hardback and softback, so it's at least affordable, because some of ththese Routledge books, and I've got to say our previous ones initially come out in this version that's only really affordable to libraries. But part of what I did put in the contract is that I insisted that it would be electronic, which was no shakes because they were keen to do that, but also that I wanted a paperback version from the word go. And thankfully we've got that, so as I always say, mere mortals can afford this book. So yeah, that's one of the things I did. Yeah, I think that's about all to say about in that sense. So have I just moved on one? Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, so I'm going to think now a little bit about the premise of the book. Part of the subtitle there, it's pretty explicit, is interdisciplinary. So that word interdisciplinary I want to focus on a little bit. When we talk about disability studies, many of us who would just use that term would think, well, disability studies is interdisciplinary anyway, and you don't get any argument from me on that. It's just that perhaps inevitably that interdisciplinary approach becomes more focused in certain areas. So what starts as disability studies a few decades ago, and we might argue about where that started. I know where I might place the beginning of that, but I'm sure lots of people in the room would say something different. But the point is, disability studies is here, it is growing, it is here to stay, and you know, obviously that's part of what we try to advance here. Disability studies then kind of opened up an area that I'm probably best known for, and that's cultural disability studies. I guess my name seems to be alongside that more than disability studies, if not as much. And then another explicitly interdisciplinary area is disability studies in education, which is kind of a newer development. So those two areas have come from that, if you like, umbrella discipline or field of disability studies. And then pretty predictably in this book, and anyone who kind of knows my work at all, or the work I'm involved with would be a better way of putting it, I've kind of brought those things together. So yes, I was known before I came here for work on cultural disability studies because of JLCDS. And then I found myself working in a faculty of education, which wasn't necessarily the plan, you know. I guess I imagined I would be working in cultural studies somewhere if I was, you know, foolish enough to kind of pinpoint a career. The more I worked with colleagues in education and so on, the less I understood the boundaries that are drawn between disciplines, and I've got to say that's still often my position, even though I'm here kind of trying to suggest another boundary, if you like, but I'm hoping that you realise that this is in the name of breaking down those divisions. Yeah, as I say, inevitably then cultural disability studies became cultural disability studies in education. For me, that bringing together of different disciplines is a part of disability studies. It's become a charge, if you like, to those of us who work in disability studies. So maybe to kind of clarify what I mean by that, some of you know that I introduced the term critical avoidance, which may explain the very introduction of JLCDS, for example. So in brief, in the humanities, for example, disability is always, or nearly always, in the text, the primary text on which so many lessons, or all lessons, are based. And yet, disability studies was, and ultimately, if I'm honest, still is rarely in the critical responses to those texts. Of course, there's been lots of advances in this, and lots of the people in the room here have contributed to those advances. But if we were to list, you know, all universities, all humanities departments and so on, unfortunately we would still find that the majority is bereft of disability studies. So that's what that term meant, critical avoidance. And you know, we could expand that on that another time. So in addressing critical avoidance then, what we essentially are doing is engaging in what we might call curricular reform. So reforming the curriculum so that it includes, embraces and takes full advantage and appreciates disability studies. So it's not kind of about inclusion in the sense that you're kind of doing something for, quote, the disabled, or it's not along those lines, although of course that's how it's often framed. It's about benefiting from an aspect of knowledge that can only be focused in certain people who have a certain experience. And I should stress, for those of you who don't know me, I certainly am one of those people. I am a disabled person. I have multiple impairments, so I can say that without fear of being kind of accused of talking about a group without speaking from within that group, if you see what I mean. I want to just stress that from the start, so you know what my positionality. Just trying to think if I need to say anything more about the premise of the book. I think that probably is okay. So have I moved on again? Yeah, so now I'll just think a little bit about the critical framework of this book. So some of you might be familiar with some of the recent work I've done, perhaps over the last 3 or 4 years, this idea of the tripartite model of disability, which, you know, as I know, is the least sexiest name of all the models that are available. I'm well aware of that. Maybe I wasn't thinking along those lines when I put this one forward, but nor did I really expect it to go further than a single article, if I'm honest. The more I thought about it and the more I wrote about it, and the more I talked to my students about it, the more I thought, you know, it actually is worth sticking with this. Those of you who have just read one article that uses this, perhaps it's worth reading something more recent, because I think it is developing. But just you know, to give a kind of a quick outline of what I'm really getting at here is that this is a departure from one-dimensional notions of disability. So it's meant to be engaging with the complexity of disability as an experience, as a way of engaging with the world. That's the intention. And I break this down, for argument's sake, into the first part of this you could consider in terms of indifference. And the terminology varies a little bit, but this is what it's kind of getting at. So this is where the world goes its own sweet way without any reference or concern or consideration for disability. So it's not an attack. It's more about just ignoring disability, as it were, but maybe not in a direct way. So that's one aspect of it. That's the first aspect. And then the second aspect is more to do with difficulties. Now, these difficulties might be the ones that come from within the body, the mind, or whatever, or the ones that we might associate more with the social model, you know, society, the barriers of community, and so on, the barriers of institutions, etc. So just difficulties in general. And then the third part, and this some of you would think more to do with perhaps disability gain or the affirmative model of disability. This is about, you know, the kind of appreciation of disability as a identity, you know, in the same way that we might appreciate gender, sexuality, and so on. Those are the three areas. And what I really want to get at is that this, for me, or by my understanding, disability is a combination of those things. So I'm all for, you know, supporting something along the lines of disability gain and so on. I'm all for disability pride. I am a proud I am a proud disabled person, but I also find quite a lot of difficulties around being disabled. And as much as I want to kind of raise my hands, and, you know, all the body parts are available, but as much as I want to do that, I can't be disingenuous and say that it was easy, I don't know, getting into work this morning or something like that, or ignore the fact that I was long-term unemployed for decades before I became fully employed in a job that appreciates what I do. So I don't want to be disingenuous, and that's why I came up with this idea of the tripartite model of disability. Doesn't mean I'm not a proud disabled person, doesn't mean I'm opposed to the social model. I'm just adding something else that as I say, if I didn't add it, I would be lying. So those are the lines. Now I'm going to try to move in and stay structured to the...
Chapter 1, Visions from the Yellow Decade.
Yeah, so I've done that deliberately so I don't lose track of where I am. So chapter 1 I'm going to think of now. Right, so the first chapter then, I should say that this is going back over decades. Visions from the yellow decade, as it were, is the 1890s. Those of you who are not familiar with this period, it's the 1890s. I'm specifically, in this chapter, I'm specifically bringing together disability studies and aesthetics. So those two fields are brought together in this first chapter. And the primary texts that I use in this chapter, perhaps predictably for those of you who know some of my work, is Maurice Maeterlinck's The Blind and Rudyard Kipling's The Light That Failed. So both problematic texts, and the first one more than the second. Now, why is the first one problematic, and why have I bothered going back to this stuff yet again? Well, one of the things that I hadn't really drawn out in my previous discussions of this text, and I should say it's a short play, and which is useful for educators and students, insofar as you could feasibly set this in class, as it were. You know, as long as you've got 12 people in the room or thereabouts, you could get the class to read this if everyone's in a position to do that, which can be quite useful. Although I've got to say it's pretty troubling, this particular text. And one of the reasons it's troubling is because what we really are exploring is what I'm terming in this book residual existence. So I just want to plant that term now, because I think in a sense these works really illustrate that idea of a residual existence. And what I mean by that is the idea, and in a sense this was touched on a little bit by Alan in what he was drawing on in that poetry this morning, which was quite satisfying for me, because clearly that experience of disability, as we so often know, resonates among disabled people, and indeed people who are appreciative of disabled experience and so on. And the idea then of this residual existence is that you have a sort of essential existence, and then you become disabled, and then what's left is but a faded echo of the past. And this is captured in the image that I showed at the beginning of the book, which is drawn from not the original version of Maurice Maeterlinck's play, but a pretty early one all the same. And basically you've got faceless people, it's kind of exploring a lifeless existence. That's what the image does. And as I say, in many ways, that idea of a residual existence is quite provocative, but also it seems to be acceptable. It seems to be assumed that is the case, that you become disabled, and then what you've got left is, as I say, just a kind of residual existence. I think I need to keep moving, because as I say, I need to keep us focused as possible.
Chapter 2, From Sideshow to Cinema.
Yeah, okay then. So chapter 2 is bringing together specifically disability studies and film studies. So you're starting to see a pattern here. So in each chapter I'm bringing different disciplines together. Remember what I said about addressing critical avoidance through means of curricular reform. So it's kind of in that spirit, although obviously on quite a low level. I'm not an expert in all of these areas. I'm touching on things outside disability studies. So this particular text, again, I want to stress it's quite a short text, the film I focus on here, which is, I guess people are pretty familiar with this, and this is Todd Browning's Freaks. So we've moved from the 1890s now to the 30s. And, it's, one of the most problematic texts, perhaps, in disability culture. But it's not straightforwardly problematic because, of course, all of the disabled characters are played by disabled people, disabled actors, which, as we know, is not even the case today. So, of course, there are lots of things to say, lots of problematics around this film that we look at, but it isn't straightforwardly or it's not straightforwardly so. It's not straightforwardly problematic. And again, that starts to bring out this idea of discussion. So in each chapter, I've broken it down into discussions. So it's, it takes a discursive form throughout. One of the things that this chapter does explore is a kind of idea of, perhaps if you were talking to Dr. Cheen, she would be able to talk to you more about something like the unforbidden romance, or the forbidden romance, I should say. And what I talk about in this chapter is more along the lines of a forbidden relationship, but then that term that I accidentally said there, the unforbidden relationship. So what I mean by that, the forbidden relationship would correspond with work that's done before. The idea of a disabled person and a non-disabled person, there's your forbidden relationship, or as I say, perhaps as Dr. Cheen might say, a forbidden romance. But there is another kind of unforbidden relationship that is perhaps interesting, and that's where you get the idea of disabled people being encouraged to be together. So it's both taboo and also expected, so that's why I use the term unforbidden as opposed to just a relationship, as it were. So that's something that's explored in that chapter. Again, I'm aware I've got to keep moving, so I'll...
Chapter 3, Remembering the Drowned and the Saved.
He talks too slow, doesn't he, when he's doing the... Chapter 3, Remembering the Drowned and the Saved. So in this chapter, I bring together disability studies and Holocaust studies. So in a sense, this is the chapter that has to be there. When we think about disability experience, and then we back that up with disability history, somewhere in that disability history, we have to have the Holocaust. This is perhaps the lowest point of all history, the nadir, if you like, of history itself. And unfortunately, there is a part of that history, and of course I realise I've been saying this since I got here, that is often forgotten. Less so today, but still generally forgotten, and that's the part that disabled people played in that, and as I say, that low point of history. And what I mean by that is the brilliant book that I talk around in this chapter by Primo Levi is called The Drowned and the Saved, and I'd highly recommend that. It doesn't talk about disability in there. So Remembering the Drowned and the Saved revisits that idea, but brings disabled people back into that in terms of the drowned in that metaphor, who as Levi himself said, can't give testimony. Alas, many disabled people were also among those drowned. So I want to kind of pick up on that. So.
Chapter 4, In the Loghouse.
Okay then, so chapter 4, I bring together disability studies and gender studies. And again, anyone who's read anything of mine in the past will be aware that I seem to be slightly obsessed with this single short story called Shiloh by Bobby Ann Mason. Again, I'm stressing the length of these things because I think they're feasible as works for educators and students, because that is part of the focus of this particular book. So this is something that you can quite easily set for your students, expect them to read without too much, trouble, as it were, before the lesson, and then you can have some fantastic discussions around this text because it's very explicit insofar as the language is very uncomplicated, but very provocative all the same. Which can be a fantastic combination. So it's a really, really good work to look at. It talks about primarily about gender, this work does. And disability, perhaps, I'm not sure that anyone else, apart from myself, has ever really looked at it in terms of disability. And I'm not necessarily bragging on this occasion when I say that. Maybe there's not as much as I make out for disability studies in that book. In that short story. But I find it certainly very good at stimulating conversation. So I'd certainly recommend it in that sense. And what it does by considering the place of disability in this story, and alongside a kind of the feminist figure of the main character, you start to get that interesting complication of intersectionality. And that's, as I say, you can get some really productive conversations around that, because essentially your natural, I'd like to think your natural sensitivities are moving in the gender position, as it were, if you see what I mean, so in the feminist track. But of course then, if you keep following that slant, then the disabled character starts to be very problematic. So it's negotiating those two that makes it complex and more rewarding, I guess. Okay.
Chapter 5, stuff happens.
Yeah, okay then. So in chapter 5, I bring together disability studies and happiness studies. So one of the things that I look at in the previous chapter is just that idea of the pursuit of happiness as something, as part of the American dream. And there are hints in that short story where you get hints of what some of us might know as cripistemology. So thanks to colleagues in the US who put forward this idea, and I'm thinking McCrewer and Johnson. So I'm just trying to think out how many people might be familiar with that concept. But it's basically thinking about epistemology, the kind of study of knowledge, if you like, in a way that's led by the disabled experience, or just briefly, I could put it like that. So in this chapter, this moves on from that. So it doesn't just touch on the idea of cripistemology, but it illustrates it quite explicitly. So I draw on a couple of works that, again, some of you have read me work on before. So there's Happiness is Blind and Molly Sweeney. And I do draw on my colleague, I'm hoping Dr. Feeney is here, and I do draw on his work in this chapter again, thanks to his work on aesthetics. I kind of touch base with him from time to time. And so this idea of happiness studies then, or this field of happiness studies, works well with disability studies insofar as, generally speaking, the idea of happiness is framed as something that's very different and perhaps diametrically opposed to being disabled. So when you bring together a kind of disability happiness, if I can put it like that for a moment, that is a contradiction of terms for many people. And that's something I try to explore in this chapter, keeping in mind that the tripartite model that I mentioned at the beginning. So I kind of give the ups and downs of the experience, but always respectfully, and also with a view to appreciation.
Chapter 6, end of the rock star.
Yeah, okay, so in chapter 6 then, I focus on disability studies and popular music studies, and I draw on the work of Dr. Barden, who again I'm hoping is here. I touch on his work to open this idea up, and this is one of those chapters that kind of came to me insofar as I just had the idea I'd like to bring a couple of texts together, and it seemed to make perfect sense. And then I mentioned it to one or two people, and they kind of said, well, I don't see how those two would come together. So I thought, oh, that's it then. It's definitely going to be good. And I was quite excited about writing. Of course, when I look back at it now, it's no better or worse than the other chapters, but I kind of, I had a thrill about writing it. Again, I'm not quite sure how much to explain in terms of what these two texts are, but these are the Days of Our Lives by Queen, and the other one is Hurt by Johnny Cash. As I say, I'm not quite sure how much to give you on this, but the concept I'm circling around in this is the passage of time, and specifically a dichotomous passage of time, which is explored in these videos. So what I mean by that is that it kind of switches from the past to the present, as though those things, as though one clicks to the other. So in the first of these popular music videos, as it were, we've got the kind of we've got Freddie Mercury looking back across his life, and he talks about the past, and but the image in the video is all of the band as they were at that point in time. So there are no flashbacks, is what I'm trying to say. But he does talk about the past a lot, and that it's an interesting lyric, actually, especially one to look at more closely. I did originally have the whole lyric in the chapter. Has anyone ever tried to get rights for don't bother, honestly. If I'm still under application to get rights for one of these, I gave up and just wrote it without the lyrics in the end, because I still haven't had a reply, and the book is out. So don't bother, frankly. Just paraphrase. But as I say, so he's looking back across his life, but with no flashbacks. That's what I really want to say there. And perhaps another thing to say that is, in both videos, you've got representation of chronic illness. So again, I should mention that I draw on Dr. Bay's work to kind of explore this idea. And so in this expression or these expressions of chronic illness, bearing in mind that in both cases the artist died pretty much soon after, this is quite a problematic representation of chronic illness, because there isn't really a lot to go on. You kind of move from chronic illness to something, well, to death, to be blunt. This is unfortunately how these things can often be framed, as we know from various approaches to narrative and so on. So that's one of the things that I wanted to pick up on in that chapter. But when you look at Hurt, this is a bit more explicit, because Johnny Cash we have him at the time, interestingly perhaps, playing in a museum that is kind of out of action. So you've got him playing in his present state, as it were, but with lots of flashbacks to the past. So the dichotomy is very explicit in terms of the passage of time. So the man he was, the non-disabled man, or at least the visibly or apparently non-disabled man, to the disabled man he became, very different, two very different entities. That's how it kind of seems. On a close reading, though, of both of these texts, what I found was useful, going back to this idea of residual existence, is that although, yes, there is that sense of dichotomy, if you look more closely, there is also an explicit reference to essence in the presence. So in the first one, the essence is love. I look and I find I still love you, as if I could ever copy Freddie Mercury. But you've got that, what is still found is love. And then in the other one, it's pain, although there is an implicit sustained love in the video, but the word, in the lyrics, it's pain. So, but the point is that in both of these videos, there is an essence in the presence, an essence of existence that deconstructs that dichotomous notion of residual existence. So instead of it being a then and now, that it moves from then to now. So, and I think that, it's quite interesting when you look at the lyrics closely and get that meaning from it, because, as I say, certainly for a long while, as I was working on that, I was reading it purely as a dichotomous thing. So I think that is perhaps quite interesting.
Chapter 7, One of the Crowd.
Okay, so we're very nearly there, folks, now. I realise I've been talking a lot here, so thanks for your patience. So one of the crowd, again, predictably, some of these are more predictable than others, aren't they? Anyone who's read my stuff on Peep Show, this is a kind of consolidated version of that. So it's shorter than the other work, but also I rethink Peep Show in a way that I have with some of my students who are here, actually, and that's insofar as that distinction that's been brought to the table of disabling comedy or disabling humour and disability humour. So generally speaking, that's quite an easy dichotomy to address. Disabled people lead disability humour, and that's quite clear. Of course, Peep Show isn't like that, because it's not led by disabled people, but it also is problematic because it uses lots of problematic language. So straight away we can just class that as disabling humour. However, when working in the satirical mode, in the realms of irony, of course, whatever you came up with, you turn upside down. So it's much more problematic. So this chapter focuses on the contradictions of comedy. So I hope, I think that's kind of worth picking up on. I think I've just...
Chapter 8, On the Campaign Trail.
Yeah, okay, so this is the final chapter. Very nearly there, folks. So on the campaign trail, brings together some of the stuff I've done on advertising campaigns in the past. But again, I reapproach this in a slightly different way. And again, those level C students who are here will be familiar with some of the things that I'm getting at here, because I've talked about them in the lectures a little bit. And I do thank Dr. Houston here, because I've drawn on her more recent stuff, people who know she's gone off and done a PhD in this area and come back to us, as it were. So she's sustained this work in a way that I wouldn't have been able to do. So one of the things then that I have done, now earlier on I mentioned, we might all have different starting points for disability studies. And I realised that whatever I would say, that someone's going to be sat there thinking, no, it's not. No, it's not. So, because I'm that person too, I sit there, no. And then you think, well, yeah, you might have a point there. Glad I kept my mouth shut. But one of the places I would certainly locate a starting point is in Paul Hunt's Stigma. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. So it goes back quite a bit further than most people would say, of course, 1966. Now, but one of the things I would also remind people there, because often, obviously my work has been challenged for its focus on culture, for example, in the past, as though disability started without reference to culture, which is frankly a lie. That was never the case. Disability studies never started without reference to culture. It was always there. It may have taken kind of more energy from other areas, because you might say, well, of course, social discrimination is more important than cultural notions that influence attitudes. Of course, I understand that. The immediacy of the social model and so on, I do appreciate and support. But there is other work that can be done that also has an impact, if less immediate. And that's, what I would get out of, say, cultural disability studies. But the point I'm making here is that in Paul Hunt's classic text, there certainly was reference to cultural representation, very explicitly so. So, for example, Lady Chatterley's lover was talked about in that text. So there you go. That's 50 years ago. Cultural disability studies was alive then. Maybe it was, it was a growing discipline, but weren't they all? So I think that's worth stressing. One of the things that was also said in that text is that, disabled people are tired of being, you know, kind of framed in terms of fear, wonder, and pity. And as I say, I apologise to my students who have already said this too, but that trinity of emotions I find quite useful when looking at, especially looking at media studies as I do in this chapter. So I will refer to in this chapter wonderful representations, fearful representations, and pitiful representations, with direct allusion to that work, to that Paul Hunt's work. And I take those emotions, as it were, or those emotional stances, to the two campaigns that you know I've looked at already, one being Dove's Real Beauty campaign, and the other one being the RNIB's See the Need campaign. So I look at both of those with that emotional trinity in mind. And the kind of general feeling I get from both of those campaigns is that you've in the first one, in the Dove campaign, you've got disability front of house, as it were. So disabled people speaking, visible, and supposedly using their own words. And I don't mean to challenge that. What I mean is, obviously, it's been edited. So that's important, and that works on that level. But there are things to read around some of the kind of claims and so on that are made in those clips. Now, the other alternative, and bear in mind what one of our colleagues has already mentioned, nothing about us without us. The RNIB has been very much engaged with blind people, visually impaired people, from the outset. Although you could argue at what level, you know, that would be, some people in the room here would know much more about that than I would. But the point that I want to pick up on is that you've got disabled people behind the scenes, often in relatively influential positions. And yet, when you look at these two representations, in fact, the Dove representation comes off a whole lot better. Yes, you've got the wonderful representations, as I term it, with a little kind of smile. But, you know, yes, you've got that representation. But in the RNIB, which came after, their advertising campaign came after the Dove one, you've got the pitiful representations and the fearful representations and nothing else. There is no blind person in those adverts, no disabled person. You know, it was all celebrities. And hence the campaign that I started, the more than needs approach. And in a sense, that's where we get to at the end of this book, because thankfully the next campaign from the RNIB was completely different. So no longer was it celebrities, and no longer was it one-dimensional, fearful, pitiful representations. It wasn't fantastic, I've got to say. But it wasn't those things. It was disabled people, front of house as well as behind the scenes. And there was a definite sense of the decades that had passed by since before Paul Hunt wrote that classic book. There we go. So I just want to say then, really at this point, just thanks again for everyone for coming. I'm reluctant to name anyone because I know that I'll miss certain people. And that's always the worst thing, isn't it? But I guess he's going to do it. Yeah. So I must thank Michelle Pryor, who has helped a lot today, as she always does with these things, and always seems to be very quiet about it. But we all appreciate her kind of support, because it just, as an academic, it just means you don't worry about certain things, to say the least. So I would want to thank Michelle and our own administrator, Jan. I'm not sure if Jan's here, but certainly that's appreciated. And Becky, who does the online store, again, much appreciated. Now I know that I wanted to start with 4 people. I've got to 3. So we'll hold that there. And then I suppose I'll thank the general people around me who were always so helpful. Obviously my partner, Heidi Mapley, who I don't think could make it. Did you make it in the end? No, a little lad was unwell, so she hasn't made it today. Obviously, I must always thank Claire Penketh and everyone in the Department for Disability and Education. And increasingly so, I must thank Dr. Ella Houston, who seemed to be joining me more often than she ought to for breakfast, which is always much appreciated. I hate having my breakfast on my own, so it's always nice to have such lovely company. And of course, everybody who is explicitly involved today. You know, that panel this morning was absolutely fantastic. When organising these things, I've got to say, I always think never again. I always do think that. But the moment Alan started to talk this morning, I just thought, oh yeah, definitely. This is fantastic. This is what it's about. And then, of course, I do extend that to our other colleagues as well.